Hi, I'm Reverend Dr. Jesse Tanner, and welcome to SCS 514, World Religions at Unity Institute and Seminary. In this present lecture, I'll be dealing with Hinduism as a religion, as a great wisdom tradition of humanity. And when we talk about Hinduism, it's important to realize that this is simply a blanket term that covers a huge number of diverse beliefs and practices that have their origin in the Indian subcontinent. And since a time out of memory, before written history, this is really the oldest religion that we will be studying. The ancient Indians themselves, thousands of years ago, felt that you can have what you want. You can have what you want. And we humans basically want four things. And these four things are the basic goals for human beings, which are believed to ensure spiritual harmony, social harmony. The first two of these four things are what we call the path of desire. And the first one is pleasure. We humans seek pleasure and avoid pain. And eventually, Hinduism says this becomes too superficial, too self-centered, too egocentric. And so you need to move beyond, ultimately, this pleasure. The second in this series of four things is success. Success like wealth, prestige, power, these types of things. But in the end, ultimately, these become too superficial, too exclusive, and insatiable. So again, the path points us forward to something beyond pleasure and success. As we move onwards or further along this path, the next two, or the last two of the four, are called the Path of Renunciation. And the first one is duty, a kind of civic or communal service to others. And the rewards of duty are honor and respect. And these are certainly to be sought after. It's one of the four things that we want, right? But again, that too is not the full story. That's not the end of the journey, at least ultimately. For ultimately, and the last of the four, is liberation, or moksha. Moksha means liberation, or freedom, ultimate freedom. And this is really the highest goal in the Hindu religion. So what exactly is liberation, or moksha? And here is where we come to what humans really want. I mean, we want these other three things, pleasure, success, and duty, but what we really want in terms of liberation or moksha is being, awareness, and joy, or happiness. Being, awareness, and joy. Nobody wants death. Nobody wants to be in the dark about things. Nobody wants to be miserable. So we want being, awareness, and joy. And we don't simply want these qualities. We want them infinitely. We want them to never end. So liberation or moksha is what Hindus call release from finitude. Release from the finitude that restricts limitless being, awareness, and joy. I think it's important to note at the outset that these aren't necessarily to be sought externally from some outside source. Hindus will talk about looking inside oneself or turning within. There's a popular Hindu legend that you've probably heard of in one form or another. Brahma, the creator god, creates all human beings with an inherent divinity. But humans, having free will, abused this divinity, and so Brahma took it away from them. And wanted to hide it somewhere. And so Brahma called a council of the gods and asks them, where should we hide this? Should we hide this divinity of humanity inside the earth? And one of the other gods is like, no, ultimately they're going to dig into the ground and find it there. That's what humans do. And Brahma's like, well, maybe we should submerge it into the ocean. Well, another god spoke up and said, no, probably not, because humans will eventually plumb the depths of the ocean as well. Well, what about atop the highest mountain? And one of the goddesses says, well, no, because humans will eventually climb the highest peak on earth and find it there as well. So Brahma thought a long time about this and finally said, aha, we'll hide their divinity in a place where they'll never ever look for it, which is at the center of their own being. They'll never look for it there. I think this illustrates that this goal of moksha is to be sought within. Now, if we turn to the anthropology within Hinduism, human beings are made up of basically 4 facets. Body, our physical body, mind or intellect, something called jiva. Jiva is kind of the individual soul of a person, and Atman. And Atman is the true, ultimately real reality that humans are. It's the really real self, that hidden, essential, spiritual reality at the core of our being. In terms of salvation, if we look at their soteriology, moksha, or liberation, is attained through the realization of one's true nature as Atman, this true undying self, and Atman's relationship with ultimate reality, or the absolute. Now, the absolute or ultimate reality in Hindu thought is called Brahman. Brahman. And Brahman is the infinite ultimate reality that always is. It never ever dies and is unlimited in being, awareness, and joy, or bliss. So Brahman is kind of the ground of being, the fountainhead of being, and the principle or source of all existence. And so Atman is often, though not always, in Hindu thought, seen to be an individual aspect or outpicturing of the eternal, universal Brahman. Now, Hindus also believe in creation. In fact, there is, the creator. One of the 3 main gods in Hinduism is Brahma, the creator god. But the worldview is very cyclical. It's not a linear type of worldview. The universe has neither a beginning nor an end. Creation's constantly happening, and this has never begun, and it never will end. This will always happen in an eternal, continual process of becoming and unfolding. And so the universe comes out of Brahman. It is birthed, if you will. It's always in Brahman, but is birthed out, and then ultimately it will return to Brahman, ultimately. Now, this cyclical understanding of time, the world, and life, this is intimately connected to our own individual life cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. And this whole process, whether we're talking about it in terms of the individual or in terms of the entire universe, this cyclical process of birth, life, death, rebirth, this is called samsara. And samsara, you can see this cycle in nature, in human lives, in the seasons that are constantly changing and then coming back around again. The world of continual change. This is samsara. Now, the human soul is continually born again and again in successive lives until one is ultimately liberated from this cycle. And so this whole process is called reincarnation, which many of you, if not most of you, are probably familiar with. One soul can be reincarnated to higher or lower forms of life or forms of consciousness, such as animals or demons, or even higher levels of devas and spiritual high consciousness realities, depending on how good or bad, helpful or unhelpful one's actions have been in the current life. So part of moksha, or liberation from the unending cycle of reincarnation, is this world that we live in, which is called samsara. And there's a causality idea involved here. Related to this reincarnation and this samsara cyclical worldview is the teaching of karma. Karma is the belief that one's actions determine, or a better way of putting it would be more like bring about, one's condition in this life and the condition in the next life when the person is reborn. So every action has its inevitable fruit or its inevitable consequence that will come about or follow from it. Basically, good or favorable deeds produce good or favorable fruits, products. And also, bad or unfavorable deeds will produce bad or unfavorable fruits or products. And not just in this life, but in the next life to come. So Hindus feel that the universe, in this sense, is completely and unerringly moral. This is a moral teaching. It's ontological also. I mean, it has to do with being, but primarily this has to do with morality. It's a fine working cosmic moral system. All actions, whether in thought, word, or deed, will have appropriate moral reactions. So every cause has its proper outcome, and it will play out in this life sometimes, but perhaps also in the next life. One's present state is made up of one's past actions, and more importantly, I think for Hindu thought, our present actions will make up our future experiences. So that's to bring attention to our current thoughts, words, and deeds. Now, there are some critics, both outside of and within Hindu thought, that would claim this to be fatalistic or deterministic. But most Hindus would disagree with this. Every decision that we make is made up by free will. And, the choices that we make in a situation are free. They're not completely determined. They're conditioned in many ways by the past, but they're not completely determined. There is such a thing as free will. So moksha also means liberation from this binding law of karma, as well as samsara. And so this is an important piece, I think, of Hindu thought. Many Westerners will look at samsara and reincarnation, and they will look at karma and will see these as positive things. Oh, we get to be born again and again and again. That's so cool. In Hindu thought, this is not something that is to be favored. This is something you want liberated from. Moksha is liberation from karma, liberation from reincarnating over and over and over again. It's being freed from this suffering cycle of samsara. So really, these aren't ultimately a good thing. I mean, you get many chances to do it over the course of many lifetimes, but ultimately, this is something you want to get away from. And that's what liberation is. Also related to these beliefs is the concept of dharma. Dharma. And in Hinduism, dharma, unlike Buddhism, usually refers to an individual's religious duty and place in life, the social responsibilities according to his or her status and age and place in life. Depending on who someone is and their position in society, their obligations are going to be quite different. Dharma can also mean the moral or spiritual foundation of the universe, the moral order of the universe. But most importantly, dharma refers to the acting in accordance with one's station in life. who you are and how do you fulfill your place in life. There's actually a cool story about this it's a Hindu legend about the guru and the scorpion. There was this guru who went down to the river with his disciple to bathe. Bathing in the river is a very important, sacred duty within Hinduism. And so the disciple's waiting on the bank with the guru's clothes while the guru, bathes himself. And while in their bathing, the guru notices that there's a scorpion struggling to cross the river and is almost drowning. So the guru picks it up in his hand and begins to wade towards the bank. But as he does this, the scorpion immediately begins to sting his hand. And the guru feels the throbbing pain of this sting and drops the scorpion for a second, but then picks that scorpion right back up and begins to again walk towards the bank. Now the scorpion again begins to sting him once again, and the pain begins to go up the guru's arm and begins throbbing all the way up, and the pain is starting to become unbearable, and of course, by reaction, the guru drops the scorpion again, but then picks it back up once more, almost to the bank, and the disciple is watching all of this and says, Guru, drop it, let it drown. You don't have to save this creature. Leave it alone. Finally, the guru gets to the bank and puts the scorpion gently on the ground, and the scorpion scampers away, of course. And the guru is sitting there in pain, his heart, his lungs, his hand is numb, and his whole arm is throbbing. It's excruciating. And the disciple asks, why? Why would you do that? Why don't you just leave that be? And the guru smiles. The disciple's completely flabbergasted by this smile. Why are you smiling? And the guru says, well, I'm smiling because everything is in its proper place. Scorpions are meant to sting. That's their dharma. And gurus are meant to save. That's our dharma. So you see, this is an illustration of what dharma means in Hinduism. The proper place in life, the duty of the scorpion is to sting. That's what scorpions do, especially when they're scared, right? And gurus are meant to save and to liberate. So the guru saved the scorpion because it was his duty, his place in life. Now let's look at some of the particularities of Hindu theology. In terms of the doctrine of God, there are two aspects of Brahman. We talked about this universal reality, the underlying ground of being, Brahman. And there are two facets of Brahman in Hindu thought. There's Saguna Brahman, the personal, tangible, visible, divine acting in the world, seen through the many gods that Hindus worship and revere. This polytheism, many gods. Hinduism has many gods that are worshipped through images, through symbols, and various other means, and each of them reflects a certain power or aspect or characteristic of the divine Brahman. The most popular of these sort of personal gods are Brahma, the creator. I've mentioned that already. There's Vishnu, the sustainer or maintainer, and there's Shiva. And Shiva is the destroyer, or the one who brings about and helps transform things from one existence to another, the transformer. Now, besides Saguna Brahman, the personal side of Brahman, there's Nirguna Brahman. And Nirguna Brahman is the transpersonal, intangible, invisible side of Brahman, side of God, which is beyond the world. And this is oftentimes characterized in the sacred syllable or sound, Om. Many of you have probably heard of Om. The Upanishads, one of the great Hindu texts, scriptures, points to this ineffable Brahman and says that Om does this pointing. So the many gods Hindus pray to and worship are all Saguna Brahman and are particular manifestations or forms of Nirguna Brahman, which is beyond words, beyond conception, beyond cognition, really. I will say just a brief word about avatars. Avatars are manifestations, or you might say incarnations, of Brahman that periodically intervene in human affairs in order to fight evil and to bring about liberation and to ensure that the universe functions according to cosmic Dharma. There's a dominant critical question that oftentimes comes up here. If we're really infinite in being, awareness, and joy at the core of our being, then why isn't this so apparent? This comes up in a lot of theology and world religions, and it's here in Hinduism as well. Why do we go through death and ignorance and unhappiness? Why? Why is that important? The Hindu answer is normally, or often, that we're distracted. That there are distractions all around us. We're distracted by this clinging, clamoring ego that we have, which prevents us from experiencing this Sat Chit Ananda, being, awareness, joy. Sat Chit Ananda. There's often an analogy that is used, really I think first popularized in the West by a scholar named Houston Smith. He talks about a dirt-covered lamp. And, originally, we have this light within us, according to Hinduism. But over time, if we don't clean the lampshade, it can get covered with dirt and dust, mud and muck. And so the goal is to clean that lampshade as much so that the light can continually shine through. So this is oftentimes the answer to that question of, why do we have to go through all of this stuff? Now, the means to overcome this basic human problem of distraction or this ego that we are dealing with, the dirt covering the lamp, Hinduism has recognized 4 basic paths to attain the true understanding of liberation, or moksha. And these paths are called yoga. And yoga is interestingly yoke, like to yoke an ox, right? Or yoke some type of beast of burden. It comes from the same Indo-European language root, yoga, yoke. It sounds the same even. But it means 2 things: to unite things together, 2 things together usually, but maybe more. But it also means to discipline. It's uniting together and disciplining towards a goal. So we must experience the truth of our existence, and so there are these 4 paths to go about yoking ourselves to our own divine Atman and Brahman. The first path to liberation is Jnana Yoga, spelled Jnana, Jnana Yoga. And so this is the path to liberation through knowledge, through study and using your intellect, philosophy, theology, these types of things. And this is kind of a paradox in Hindu thought, because you're trying to attain knowledge of the unknowable, which is beyond knowledge. You're trying to conceive of the unconceivable through various types of conception and intellectual reflection. But this use of study and contemplation and reflection to realize one's own true nature as Atman, which is a part of Brahman, this is an important path of yoking, of yoga. It's it's just one of the four, but it's none of these is necessarily better than the other. There's no hierarchy here. The second is Bhakti Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga is the path to liberation through devotional love. One directs one's energies towards Brahman through devotion, through loving kindness. And this method makes a bit of a division between Atman and Brahman, between self and God. So it's a little bit more dualistic. God and self are seen as two rather than one. And oftentimes the way this is done is by chanting God's name or meditating on a particular image in order to cultivate this love for God completely and thoroughly with no ulterior or non-genuine motives. Then there's Karma Yoga, and Karma Yoga is the path to liberation through work or action. Humans seem to be designed for action, according to Hindu thought. When you don't feel productive, or if you don't feel active, we tend to feel like we're languishing a little bit, becoming a little weaker. The idea is to unite your effort in action with the effort to realize your connection to Brahman, or God. So one sees oneself as a kind of for the hands and feet of God, if you will, working and acting in the world until ultimately this barrier, this distinction between Atman and Brahman begins to dissolve away. And the last type of yoga is Raja Yoga, or Raja means chief or king, monarch even. And this path to liberation is through psychosomatic experiences. And this is probably the kind that's most popularized in the West. People have sometimes called this a more scientific or experimental approach because it does use a kind of experimentation to realize the deeper self. They try different mental and physical processes to achieve higher levels of consciousness and awareness. So the goal is to experience the beyond, which just happens to be within each and every one of us. And there are many different methods or techniques that have been developed over the centuries for this. Some of them are morality centered, like no lying, stealing, violence, no attachment, no excessive sensuality, that type of thing. A lot of ascetic practices would fall into this category. But then there are also things like study, which is linked to Jnana Yoga, but also breath control activities and mental acuity and focus activities. But the gist is to do away with all distractions in order to experience that oneness. One sort of subcategory of this yoga is called Hatha Yoga. And Hatha Yoga, also known as Forceful Yoga, Hatha means forceful. And this would be a way for preparing the body to be more comfortable to realize these higher states of consciousness. So, you'll see yogis contorting their body in different ways and creating that flexibility. These physical postures or asanas are really to help align the energy centers in the body, but they're also meant to increase flexibility so that when you're sitting for long hours and hours in forms of meditation, the body doesn't get tired or fatigued, and in cultivating the soul for moksha. So those are the four main types of yoga: Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Raja Yoga. Now let's look at briefly some of the schools of philosophical thought within Hinduism. The predominant types of current Hindu thought could be divided into three categories. And the first school of thought is the Samkhya Philosophy. Now Samkhya says that moksha, or liberation, is attained through yogic discipline, primarily Raja Yoga. This, the experimentation with different different mind and body exercises. And this results in liberation into a pure type of consciousness from the physical, let me say that again, it's liberation into a pure type of consciousness and liberation from the physical material world, which Samkhya philosophy sees the physical material world as illusory. It's not really real. It's just a figment of the imagination in Brahman, God. So besides Samkhya, we also have the Vaisheshika philosophy, and this is a school of thought that sees moksha as a process of liberation through reasoning and a right kind of understanding of the universe. So if you get it right in your understanding, then the liberation will come. And so it's, the universe and oneself are merely a collection of physical and non-physical qualities or aspects put together in a kind of combination so as to result in this type of experience. So if you get that right, once you understand that at the deepest level, then moksha or liberation will be attained. And the last school of thought, which is probably the most popular school of thought in the West, is called Vedanta. And so the Vedanta philosophy is about moksha, fulfilling one's dharmic duties, which results in the cessation of reincarnation, and ultimately you realize your oneness with Brahman, or I don't know if oneness is the right word, but at least your true relationship to Brahman. And I say that because there are three sub-schools within the Vedanta philosophy. There's Dvaita Vedanta, and Dvaita means two. So Atman and Brahman are actually two. They're not the same thing, and they are not one. They are two. So Dvaita Vedanta is one form of Vedantic philosophy. Then there's Advaita Vedanta. Advaita means not two. So Atman and Brahman are really one and the same thing. And then there's Vishishtadvaita. And Vishishtadvaita Vedanta means that Atman and Brahman are neither the same nor different. They're neither one nor two. They're something else. It's maybe a spiritual or sacred mystery. So you have these different sub-schools of thought as well within Hinduism. Let's take a look briefly at the scriptures within Hindu thought. If we were to put the scriptures in a room, they would fill a huge room, top to bottom. There's so many of them that date from 1300 BCE, really until modern times. Because unlike the Abrahamic traditions, the Eastern religions, or at least particularly Hinduism, we're talking about Hinduism, there isn't a closed canon, really. The canon can be added to depending on the community and the perceived authority of the text. So new scriptures can still be written and considered authoritative, meaningful, important, transformative. But all of these sacred texts and writings are composed in Sanskrit, an ancient Indian language that's really now only used by scholars, or known by scholars and Hindu priests. But it's an ancient language. The first collection is called the Vedas. Veda means knowledge, and so the earliest Hindu writings are considered Shruti. Shruti it really means to be heard or revealed. It's the highest level of authority in Hindu sacred scripture. So if something is Shruti, it has a very high authority given to it. Not necessarily like it's infallible or something like that, but sometimes it gets pretty close to that. So the Vedas contain three main types of literature. Hymns of praise, praising various kinds of deities. There are also, besides hymns, details explaining how to do these rituals and the different sacrifices made to gods. And in the Vedas, a very popular god is the fire god called Agni. And thirdly, the Vedas are composed of different analyses or interpretations of those rituals. So kind of like commentaries, if you will. And one of these important commentaries on the Vedas is called the Upanishads. I mentioned it a few minutes ago. And the Upanishad itself means to sit down near. So you're kind of sitting near and at the feet of the Vedas or the Vedic masters. And these are elaborations on the ideas that are contained in the hymns and the ritual sacrificial instructions. Now with the Upanishads, we begin to see a departure from a lot of the ritualistic orientation that we see in the Vedas, or in the predominance of the Vedas. There's a departure from those fire rituals and a more personal concern with the spiritual development of the individual in relationship to others and in relationship to reality itself. They're really concerned about the liberation of the individual. Besides the Vedas and the Upanishads, there are what we call epics. And the epics are not Shruti, or a really high level of authority, but they are called Smriti. And Smriti essentially just means remembered. And it has a lower level of authority. It's still important, and it's seen as, by many Hindus, as a daily part of their practice. But it doesn't have as high of an authority as the Vedas and the Upanishads. The two main epics are the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. These are compilations of folk tales and songs and heroic stories written in honor of great kings or warriors and great people that convey the common feature of Brahman entering into human life for the good of humans and finding a way to triumph over evil. Good triumphing over evil. That's almost some kind of a archetype. We see that in all kinds of religious traditions, and we definitely see it here. These narratives are, again, very long, and but oftentimes are to be recited or sung, and so they can be quite beautiful. Probably the most popular and well-known is the Bhagavad-Gita, which means Song of the Lord. The Bhagavad-Gita is just a smaller piece, a smaller epic within this huge epic of the Mahabharata. And it's a highly, highly influential scripture within Hinduism. Even today, it's recited and read by a significant portion of Hindu devotees. It's a kind of discourse or dialogue between Krishna. Krishna is an avatar, an incarnation of the god Vishnu. And it's a conversation, if you will, between Krishna and Prince Arjuna, who is a great warrior going into battle. Arjuna is on the battlefield, poised to go into battle with his cousin, actually. And they're warring over the same turf. And so he seeks advice from his chariot driver and his guide, who just happens to be Krishna in disguise. And in this discussion between Krishna and Arjuna, Arjuna has a big moral dilemma. He doesn't know if he should go into battle with his relatives, because this will generate bad karmic effects. And he's afraid that these bad karmic effects from all the violence and bloodshed will lead to a bad rebirth, a lower rebirth. So, but on the other hand, many people are counting on him as a general, as a great warrior, to win the battle. And so really we see here a playing out of tension between two central Hindu theological principles. A tension between karma and dharma. Which should he follow? His duty, his dharma, as a great warrior and king? Or should he be concerned about his karma and how the negative effects that these actions might have? He wants to simply not act. He really just wants to not generate any karma, and he thinks that'll be good. But in the course of their conversation, Krishna reveals himself as Krishna, and Arjuna's eyes are opened, and so Arjuna is told by Krishna that one, dharma, or the duty to act, is what holds the entire universe together. So it's what grounds the universal harmony of everything. And so this duty to act is based on his karma, on acting. So Arjuna must not act against his duty in life. He must act according to who he is in this place and time, in this stage of life. And so as a warrior, his duty is to fight and live out this battle. And since it's his proper duty, it will not actually generate any negative karmic effects. So you see how theologically this is being worked out. But also, Krishna tells Arjuna that all paths to liberation are equally valid, equally legitimate. Jnana, karma, bhakti, raja yoga, they're all equal, but there's a clear preference being shown in the Bhagavad-Gita for Bhakti Yoga, or devotional love yoga. Devotion to Krishna as the person who is the Lord of the universe, the loving and guiding, gracious Lord of the universe. So the Bhagavad-Gita is a central Hindu text, so it's important to at least know about it. Then there's the caste system. We really can't talk about Hinduism without mentioning and explaining and making sense out of the caste system. In Sanskrit, the caste is dasa, and dasa really means color. So it's like a colored system. So there's racial undertones or overtones to this. It's really an Indian social system of hereditary classes of people, which really forbids change and movement from one caste to another. It's quite hierarchical. The origin of the caste system is this racial separation of the light-skinned Indo-European Aryans who came freely from Europe but traveled all the way across the Persia, Middle East, Persia, and into the Indus River Valley. And they entered India around 2000 BCE. And they automatically took over and subjugated the darker-skinned native Indian peoples there. That's how it originated, and then it developed from there. And caste regulates, or used to regulate, and often still does, regulate all aspects of Indian life. I mean, early on, there was the ability to mobilize and move around from one caste to another, but later on this became much more restrictive to where you would really live and die in whatever caste you were born into. There are four main castes: Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. Now, the Brahmins are priests, basically. They are sort of the philosophers of society who plan and organize society. They're at the top. There's fewer of them, they're at the top. And of course, the Indo-European Aryan people who came into India thousands of years ago, it's really those descendants. There's also the Kshatriyas below them, who are nobles. They are administrators, they are organizers and governors. So they have a high social status, but not quite as high as the Brahmin priests. Then under them is the Vaishyas, who are skilled workers, artisans, people who have a skilled trade, those kinds of things. And then under them, of course, would be the Shudras, who are laborers and unskilled workers. And below them, really, there's an unspoken group of people called the Outcasts. Literally, that name, outcast, means they're outside of the caste system. They're really, truly seen as nobodies. And these people are completely destitute, begging on the streets. In 1949, this caste system was officially outlawed by the Indian government. But, of course, this isn't universally observed by everyone. There are many people in India who still follow it to this day. Now, we might ask, what are the benefits and deficits of this caste system thing? I mean, the benefits, one might argue, is that, it creates solidarity and a kind of equality within the caste itself. Each caste, there's a kind of equality there. It balances social demand and reward, some people have argued, because there are more demands on you the higher up you are in the caste hierarchy. Because the Brahmins are held to a much higher standard, and their karmic effects and their Dharma are, there's more consequences. With great power comes great responsibility, right? I mean, that's kind of the idea here. But many Hindus and non-Hindus would, they reject this whole system as unjust and as immoral. There were whole movements, even in the ancient world, in BCE, where, Buddhism is one of them, that came out and really rejected the caste system altogether. Now let's look finally at worship in Hinduism. In early Vedic times, worship usually took the form of sacrificial rituals, of sacrificing animals or burning honey and milk that would be poured onto a fire to make smoke. Sometimes we see in the Vedas reference to a plant called Soma, S-O-M-A, Soma. We have no idea what this plant is, but there's reference to it, and it was used in sacrificial rituals. And these were offerings to the gods and goddesses to make them happy, to please the gods and goddesses, and thus they would return the favor and help humans create a more orderly and happy society. That was the idea. So all of this was accompanied by chanting the Vedic hymns, reciting them, and prayers which were often memorized and passed on orally. This was an oral culture. So this kind of worship doesn't really happen anymore, according to the Vedic rituals. The form of worship that's most popular or common in modern day Hinduism is what's called puja. Puja is a ritual of devotional worship that's usually performed either at a temple by a Brahmin priest, or it can also be performed, and is often performed, in the homes of families, at a household shrine. So puja is done toward any of the many gods and goddesses within Hindu thought, but most important really are Vishnu and Shiva. We see Vishnu and Shiva all the time, and they appear in various forms and aspects of Hindu myths, stories, images, and symbols. Temples or shrines that are dedicated to a certain deity will often have a beautiful, ornate image of the god to whom one is devoting oneself, often in the temple or at the altar in the home. And so it's to this image that the puja happens. During the puja ritual, the priest or the practitioner will ritually purify him or herself and purify the shrine, and then they will invoke the presence of the god or the goddess into the image, call the god into the image itself and the shrine, and then worship the image by ritually bathing it, treating it kindly, giving gifts to it, feeding it symbolically, and maybe waving a light or a lamp in a circle around it, circumambulating it like this, because the light represents holiness and wisdom and divinity. And also, short prayers would be repeated over and over and over again, and these are called mantras. They're chanted along with these actions to make it more meaningful and memorable. Well, I think we'll stop there for Hinduism. This provided something of an outline, or at least some type of a framework for integrating the varied but basic beliefs and practices of Hinduism as one of the great wisdom traditions of humanity. Thank you.